We as liberals want to help the poor, and that makes us more moral. And I would love to hear conservatives come back and say, well, now that depends on how...
You can watch the rest of this online as we take you now to the floor of the House back in for a round of votes on bills debated earlier today.
H.R. 4367, H.R. 5892, in each case by the yeas and nays. First electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote. Remaining electronic votes will be conducted as 5-minute votes. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4155 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 424, H.R. 4155. A bill to direct the head of each federal department and agency to treat relevant military training as sufficient to satisfy training or certification requirements for federal licenses.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
And the House taking up votes on bills under suspension of the rules debated earlier today. This is H.R. 4155, as you heard. They're going to be voting on this for 15 minutes. It's the Veteran Skills to Jobs Act, making it easier for veterans to find jobs using skills that they got in the military as they transition into civilian work. With a look at Capitol Hill, we're joined by Billy House. He's a writer for National Journal Daily. Billy, as House lawmakers are returning from the 4th of July break, what's on the legislative agenda this week?
Well, a lot of messaging on such things as health care and other items. Also, a big event is the markup on Wednesday by the House Agriculture Committee of the Farm Bill, 5-year Farm Bill.
And the repeal of the health care law, is that a top priority for House Republicans?
Well, that is the major priority. It's a bill to repeal fully the health care law, although they've actually already passed that last January. But in light of the Supreme Court's decision last month, they want to reaffirm, at least in the public's mind, that they intend to repeal the entire law.
And why are they making this a top priority?
Mostly because this is the stretch run to the fall elections, and also that they believe it scores points in their individual races. One of the wrinkles in this, though, is that the CBO announced today, Monday, that it doesn't have a scoring of the bill or the law itself as it now stands based on the changes that the Supreme Court language would bring. So essentially what Republicans would do this week, and they plan to debate all day tomorrow on this, and then possibly vote Wednesday, is pass a bill without really knowing the ramifications on the budget of their repeal.
Yeah, now as this comes to the House floor on Tuesday possibly, House Democrats say this will be the 31st vote to repeal President Obama's health care law. How do they figure that, and what's the point of keeping count?
I think the point of keeping count is to address what they say is the repetitive and wasteful, in their view, time the Republicans are spending on this. They get to 131 by not only doing the votes to fully repeal the bill, but there have been dozens of votes to repeal parts of the law individually.
Now, are House Republicans planning more votes related to repealing the health care law in the coming months?
It's unclear what they have planned for the upcoming months. The bill that on Monday was going before the Rules Committee and would be the focus of the floor debate Tuesday and the vote Wednesday, unlike the bill last year, does not really require the relative committees to come up with a replacement for the health care law. So it seems to be in flux what exactly they plan to do over the next few weeks and months.
Go ahead.
Of course, the Senate will not pass this bill, so and the president won't sign it, so it's all kind of a messaging thing, as we started out saying.
How is this issue playing among constituents on both sides of the aisle?
it's kind of mixed. I mean, there's a general knee-jerk reaction, according to some polls, against being forced to participate in anything. Mm-hmm. However, when it's more fully explained, there's a greater and wider acceptance of the law.
Billy House with National Journal Daily. Thanks so much.
No, thank you.
The House in the middle of a vote here. Veterans Skills to Jobs Act, making it easier for veterans to find jobs using skills that they got in the military as they come back and transition into civilian work and require licenses from the federal government and others. This is a 15-minute vote. It's the first of 3 that it looks like they're going to be taking up in this round of votes. Over in the Senate today, Majority Leader Harry Reid criticized the House vote scheduled to appear on the floor tomorrow on repealing the health care law. We just heard from Billy House about that. Harry Reid said the House has voted 31 times already to repeal it, and the House is wasting time on a political vote while the Senate is working on a business tax break to encourage job creation. Here's what he had to say.
Mr. President, last month we got a lot done. It was incredibly productive. Congress and President Obama worked together to prevent interest rates from doubling for more than 7 million college students. And we also worked to put 2.8 million Americans back to work or create new jobs to rebuild our crumbling roads, bridges, and other parts of our transportation system. We passed an FDA bill, which was so necessary to focus on why we have, among other things, why we have these shortages of life-saving drugs. We also passed something that will allow the construction industry to go forward by passing flood insurance for the entire country. We passed a farm bill that will strengthen the agriculture industry, supporting some 16 million jobs. We're able to accomplish this much last month because Republicans and Democrats worked together and compromised. Rather than wasting time participating in political theater, we actually legislated. I'd hope to continue that productive process in this work period, characterized by cooperation between lawmakers on both sides of the Capitol and between both chambers. Unfortunately, we already know that our colleagues in the House are going to waste much of their short work period refighting very, very old battles. Republicans indicated that they would support the ruling of the Supreme Court. They, in fact, said the Supreme Court is going to decide this matter regarding the affordable health care. Well, they've changed their tune. Mitt Romney has said he would nominate Supreme Court justices just like Justice Roberts. I wonder if he's saying that to his right-wing base today. But now that the court has upheld this landmark health care reform with a majority decision written by Justice Roberts, Republicans refuse to admit the matter is settled. This week the House will vote, Mr. President, this is almost hard to comprehend, for the 31st time to repeal health care reform. They've already voted 30 times. Speaker Boehner said, let's do it again. 31 times. 31 times taking many, many hours, many, many days that should have been spent toward creating jobs. Congressional Republicans have spent months trying to repeal a law that's already saved lives and made people more safe as they look at health care in this country. So, Mr. President, while House Republicans hold a political show vote, the Senate will take a different approach. We're going to continue to try to be constructive, focus on jobs. While Republicans are stuck in the past, we'll be addressing those pressing issues facing this nation, creating jobs and securing the economy. Last week's jobs report underscored the fact that Congress must do more to strengthen the recovery. So the Senate will immediately consider a package of common sense tax cuts that will lower the cost of doing business for small business and pave the way for these small businesses to succeed. Our legislation will cut taxes for small firms and invest in new workers and equipment. The Small Business Jobs and Relief Act will provide a 10% tax credit for for companies that add up to $5 million to their payroll, creating hundreds of thousands of new jobs. Businesses are eligible for a tax break if they hire new workers or if they raise the wages of hardworking employees already on their payroll. And because the credit is capped at $500,000, it is targeted to benefit small businesses most. Legislation will also allow companies to write off the entire cost of purchases, such as new equipment. They'll be able to do it in the year that purchases are made, instead of writing them off over long periods of time. More than 2 million companies could get a boost to their bottom line, creating hundreds of thousands of more jobs. Proposals like these have garnered Republican support in the past. I hope they'll receive the same bipartisan support again tomorrow. After our weekly caucus meetings, tomorrow the Senate will vote to end a Republican filibuster and begin to debate these tax cuts. Democrats can't undertake the work of strengthening our economy alone. We'll need Republican support, which is why we proposed consensus tax cuts that should pass the Senate overwhelmingly. It was good to see so many reasonable Republicans willing to work with us last month to save college students money, rebuild the nation's infrastructure, and protect American farmers. Tomorrow, Republicans will have an opportunity to prove they're willing to continue to work with us to create middle-class jobs.
We're following the House Rules Committee right now over on C-SPAN 2 as they discuss that repeal of the health care law. You can watch the members in committee over on our companion network, as well as anytime online at the C-SPAN video library. And we're in the middle of a vote here on the House floor, Veteran Skills to Jobs Act, making it easier for veterans to find jobs using skills that they got in the military as they transition into civilian work. This is the first of 3 expected votes that the House is taking up in this round. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie spoke earlier today about his fiscal agenda and efforts to reform the government in his state. And the governor and Democrats in the legislature have been going back and forth in recent days over the issue of tax cuts. A former U.S. attorney, Governor Christie, is frequently mentioned as a possible running mate for presidential candidate Mitt Romney.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for welcoming me here today. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you about what's been going on in New Jersey and how I think it applies to what we need to be confronting and discussing, not only in states like New Jersey, but in all the states across the country and our federal government as well. 2 weeks ago, I signed my 3rd balanced budget in a row since becoming governor. Now, it's a budget that increases spending on K-12 education to a record level, $8.8 billion this year in state aid to K-12 education. It increases aid for tuition assistance for children who need it to head to college, supports our most vulnerable, including our veterans, individuals facing disabilities, the working poor, and makes a down payment, a significant down payment on our pension obligation. In fact, the largest single contribution that any governor has made to our state pension system in its history, $1.1 billion this year. At the same time, I used my line item veto authority to veto $360 million in special interest spending so that our budget this year in fiscal year 2013, which has just begun, is still smaller than the fiscal year 2008 and 2009 budgets signed by my predecessor, Governor Corzine. Pretty good budgetary success. We're happy with it. We think we can do better, but there's one thing that did not happen that I think should have happened and we're going to continue to talk about, and that's tax cut for middle-class New Jerseyans. That's kind of interesting that I hear this morning on my way in that the President is now going to propose today extending tax relief for middle-class Americans. Yet in New Jersey, despite promises that we've had for tax cut to happen, that tax cut was left on the table at the last minute. Let me give you a little background. I started off in my State of the State address in January of 2010, or January of 2012, rather, advocating for a 10% across-the-board income tax rate reduction. New Jersey has the 3rd highest income tax rate for any state in America, behind only California and Hawaii. Our top rate is just a shade under 9%. and we believe that reducing rates across the board would be one of the best ways to make New Jersey more competitive with our neighbors. To give you some example, our tax rates are higher than the state of New York, higher than the state of Connecticut, and our neighbor in Pennsylvania has a top rate of 3%. And so when you're competing in the kind of job market that we're all competing in right now, states are fiercely competing with each other in basically two ways beside the normal type of services that states provide, infrastructure and education, higher education, those type of issues. You're really competing on two levels. Tax competitiveness, which has two parts to it. What tax incentives are you willing to give to either retain companies or to attract new companies there? And what is the tax environment for that company once it is there, both for them and for their employees, who they'll be asking if they're moving into your state to relocate from one state to New Jersey. That's the reason why I think tax reductions are so important in our state in the current environment. It's because we're competing. We're competing with these other states that have significantly lower rates in some instances like Pennsylvania and Delaware, and we're not competing well in that regard because of the atmosphere that's been created over a period of years. And so I advocated for an across-the-board income tax cut. I have, by the way, a state with a great sense of humor, some of you may know, not just because of native sons like Jon Stewart, but also because our voters elected a conservative Republican governor and retained a Democratic legislature. And so I think they just wanted to see what would happen. And we'll talk a little bit about that this morning. But the state Senate president came back with a counterproposal, which is essentially an income tax credit of 10% against whatever amount of property taxes you pay in our state, up to a cap of $1,000 per taxpayer. There were certain limits, and I'll get into the weeds about it. There were certain limits that were put on it in terms of income eligibility, et cetera. And so as we moved along through the spring, I began conversations with him about finding some way to compromise to be able to bring a tax cut package to the people of the state. And we came to an agreement in the late spring of this past year on a 10% income tax credit that would be capped at folks with incomes under $400,000 a year, would exempt any business income that they made from Schedule C on the federal returns, and would apply equally to all those people under $400,000 a year, and we would increase our earned income tax credit. So we have a state earned income tax credit, will be increased from 20% above the federal level to 25%. This was going to mean everybody $400,000 a year under who was employed in New Jersey would be getting tax relief. And we'd phase it in to be fiscally responsible over 3 years, so the hit to the budget would not be significant. We had an agreement until normal politics set back in. And when the Senate president went back to his caucus and went over to the Assembly, the lower house, they decided that what was much more important, and this has been reported in the newspapers extensively in New Jersey, was that it was more important for me not to be able to go to the Republican National Convention in Tampa and say that I got a tax cut for the people of our state than it was to actually give the people of our state a tax cut. Unfortunately, this was a reversion back to old politics that had been seen relatively infrequently over the last 2.5 years in New Jersey. And so we're going to have a fight about this over the summer. I'm looking forward to it. I called them back into special session. They thought they were leaving on June 28th, the end of the session, ready for summer vacation. Our Constitution allows the governor to call the legislature back in for special session. I did on July 2nd. Gave a speech on July 2nd to them about the importance of trying to reach bipartisan compromise on this issue, that making our state more competitive and giving our taxpayers some relief was extraordinarily important and much more important than the politics of the day, especially for a speech that I have not yet been invited to give at a convention I know I'll attend, but that I have absolutely no knowledge at the moment whether I'll even be speaking at the convention. But obviously they're real concerned about that. So I offered my hand in compromise to the Democrats on the issue of taxes, and the hand was slapped back. Now, the question for executive leadership at that moment is, what do you do? There's two options, as I see it. Option number one is to go in the corner, hold your breath, say, I'm not working with these people anymore because they're mean, and they're not nice to me, and they don't want to compromise, and I'm just going to send out really nasty press releases about them and tell everybody how rotten they are. Or you can shrug your shoulders and say that the job you were given is more important than your ego or the politics of the day, and continue to try to fight to get compromise reached. I think the evidence of the last 2.5 years will show you that I have consistently, along with a number of leaders of the legislature, picked the latter rather than the former. And I think it's important to review that with you at the moment so that you can get some context to the current discussion. Where was New Jersey when I became governor in January 2010? Let's start with the fact that a week into the job, my chief of staff and the state treasurer came to my office and told me that if we did not cut $2.2 billion from the current fiscal year budget, fiscal year 2010 budget, that we were 7 months into, within 6 weeks, that we would not make payroll for the second pay period in March. Now imagine New Jersey, the second wealthiest state per capita in America, was going to have to give out IOUs to state employees the second pay period in March. I don't know how you define broke, but that looked like broke to me from where I sat. And so we had two choices. We could either negotiate with the legislature, and they made clear at that moment, in the very beginning of my term, that it would have to include tax increases, immediate tax increases, retroactive tax increases. Or, because New Jersey's Constitution is the most powerful governorship constitutionally in America, George Will calls New Jersey's governor America's Caesar. I really like that. A lot. I could act by executive order and essentially impound funds by executive order equal to the amount of cuts that were necessary. Now, for those of you who have watched me for the last 2.5 years, either closely or just vaguely, if you believe that I picked option number one, you did not earn your invitation here this morning. You need to leave. There's no chance I was picking option number one. I selected option number two and sat down and went through 2,400 lines of the state budget and found $2.2 billion in cuts and made those cuts by executive order, went to the state legislature and presented them in a joint session speech. And after I was done with the speech, and essentially the speech was about 40 minutes long. Given our time constraints this morning, I will boil it down to you to about 15 seconds. I went up there and I said, listen, you left me with this huge problem. I needed to fix it. You wanted to raise taxes. I'm not going to. So I just made $2.2 billion in cuts by executive order. I signed it. I fixed your problem. You can thank me later. Have a good day. And I left. You can imagine the atmosphere on the floor of the legislature after I was done. I was called all kinds of names, things like Napoleon Bonaparte and Julius Caesar, all those great leaders of the past that I admire so much. And the next day I saw the Senate President, Steve Sweeney. We were coming into the State House at the same time together. Now, you need to understand, Steve is a Democrat from the southern part of our state. He's the Senate President, and as such, the most powerful Democrat in the state of New Jersey. And he is the president of the Iron Workers Local in New Jersey. So, like me, a shy and retiring guy, I saw Steve on the way in, and I said, Steve, I saw all those things you said about me in the newspaper, today, and, you've really turned me around. I'm going to go upstairs and vacate the executive order, and I'm going to send this problem down the hall. You guys can fix it. And this is all you need to know about New Jersey politics for the next 2.5 years from that date. Steve looked at me and goes, hey, Governor, don't overreact, I don't think you did all that bad. I mean, come on. It's politics. It's politics. But we inherited a huge problem. What caused that huge problem, in my view? 115 tax and fee increases in the 8 years before I became governor. 115 tax and fee increases at the state level in the 8 years before I became governor. That's a tax and fee increase every 25 days for 8 years. Now, if you want a definition of how to kill the goose that laid the golden egg, look at New Jersey's economy in the 80s and 90s, one of the top economies in the country among any of the states, and then look at what happened when we began to do that in the 8 years before I became governor. We had an unemployment rate that was over 10%, 155,000 private sector jobs lost under the previous administration, highest tax burden in the country, the worst climate for small business growth, highest number of government workers per square mile in the country. It's quite a distinction. And all those things were dropped in our lap when we came into office. Now, when you're confronted with that with a Democratic legislature, you'd have to make some very specific and difficult choices. And we moved specifically into fiscal year 2011, which had a projected budget deficit of $11 billion on a $29 billion budget. 37% deficit, by percentage, the largest budget deficit of any state in the country. And once again, there was a call for higher taxes. It seemed to me that this call was what had gotten us, at least in part, in trouble in the first place. So what we did was propose a budget that cut every Department of State government, everyone without exception, and had to make significant cuts, as you can imagine, to close a budget deficit of $11 billion. But we did. And the folks in the legislature sent me what's become in vogue apparently lately around in some parts of the country. They sent me a millionaire's tax surcharge. Now, you got to understand first, before we go too far down the road about the history of a millionaire's tax in New Jersey, we already have a millionaire's tax. But in New Jersey, it's very special because we have special New Jersey math.
These are 0. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4367, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 416, H.R. 4367, a bill to amend the Electronic Fund Transfer Act to limit the fee disclosure requirement for an automatic teller machine to the screen of that machine.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
And the House taking up votes on bills under suspension of the rules debated earlier today. We already had a vote on the Veteran Skills to Jobs Act. This is the Electronic Fund Transfer Act. It would get rid of a requirement that ATMs have placards posted with the ATM fees. The disclosures would instead just be required on screen only. This is a 5-minute vote, the second one of 3 expected in this round.
On this vote, the yeas are 371, the nays are 0. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business of the vote on the motion of the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. McMorris Rodgers, to suspend the rules, pass H.R. 5892, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 404, H.R. 5892, a bill to improve hydropower and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.
This is the third and final vote expected in this round in the House floor today. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that implementing this bill, the Hydropower Regulatory Efficiency Act, would have no significant impact on the federal budget. It's paid for by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission through user fees.
are 372. The nays are 0. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to remove myself as a co-sponsor of H.R. 3798, the Egg Products Inspections Act.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I yield back. Amen.
We like to be a little lower. Yes, sir.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass S-2061, the former Charleston Navy-based Land Exchange Act of 2012.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 2061, an act to provide for an exchange of land between the Department of Homeland Security and the South Carolina State Ports Authority.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on S-2061 currently under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
And Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this legislation authorizes the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security to transfer property located in South Carolina and owned by the United States in exchange for property owned by the South Carolina State Ports Authority. The Department will acquire land that is important to the continued operation and development of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center's Maritime Academy. The State of South Carolina will acquire land that will allow the South Carolina State Ports Authority to develop an access road to Interstate 26. This exchange would have already occurred, but the Department of Homeland Security Secretary lacked the authority to engage in the transfer of real property. This bill gives the Secretary the necessary authority to facilitate this transaction. This is a common-sense solution that will benefit both the State of South Carolina and the United States. This bill and the underlying land exchange is supported by the Governor of South Carolina, the South Carolina State Ports Authority, and the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The Senate passed this bill by unanimous consent last month. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan legislation, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of Senate Bill 2061, the former Charleston Naval-based Land Exchange Act of 2012. This bill authorizes the Secretary of Homeland Security to convey a parcel of federal land in North Charleston, South Carolina, to the South Carolina State Ports Authority in exchange for specified lands owned by the Ports Authority. The land to be transferred by the Department of Homeland Security formerly comprised a portion of the Charleston Naval Base, but is now vacant. DHS currently leases the land it plans to acquire in this transfer and uses it to house some of the operations of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, also known as FLETC. The Charleston Harbor area includes the 4th busiest international container shipping port in the United States, with 1 passenger and 4 container port terminals, as well as numerous privately held terminals. The waterways in this area contain shipping channels, rivers, bays, creeks, streams, the intracoastal waterway, and the Atlantic Ocean. These waterways provide a realistic training environment for FLETC's maritime, law enforcement, and port security students. Specifically, the FLETC Charleston facility is one of FLETC's 3 residential training centers and includes a variety of specialized capabilities for maritime, law enforcement, and port security training. The facilities include 4 deep water piers for large commercial or military vessels and 3 sets of floating docks for smaller vessels. Students at the FLETC Charleston facility engage in programs such as commercial vessel boarding training, maritime tactical operations training, and seaport security anti-terrorism training. All of these programs are critical to protecting our nation from the potential of a variety of criminal and terrorist threats. By allowing the mutually beneficial transfer of the lands between the Port Authority and DHS, we are advancing the important mission of the FLETC. I urge my colleagues to support Senate Bill 2061, which the Senate has already adopted, so that it may become law. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers on this side and am prepared to yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from California.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back.
The balance of my time as well.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate Bill 2061? Those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended and the bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The Chair will entertain requests for one-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia seek recognition?
Question, Mr. Speaker, 1 minute to provide and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, the House just won't let up on American women. Tomorrow features a committee markup to deprive women of their constitutional right to an abortion. The bill picks on D.C. women because Republicans don't have the nerve to introduce this frontal attack on Roe v. Wade as a nationwide bill. But they make no secret of their purpose. They have already gotten several conservative states to pass similar laws, and they seek a federal precedent, but they can't get a legitimate one. Women will easily see a House-only bill based on bogus science and limited to D.C. for what it is, the latest in a series of attacks on women's reproductive health this term. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there further requests for one-minute speeches? The Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leaves of absence requested for Mr. Coble of North Carolina for today, Mr. Culberson of Texas for today, and Mr. Desjardins of Tennessee for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. Up top. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Christensen, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I ask unanimous consent that all speakers may have, I ask unanimous consent for them to be able to revise and extend their remarks in accordance with the subject of the special order this evening.
Without objection.
And I'd like to enter into the record a statement from Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson. Thank you.
It will be covered by general leave.
Thank you. And I want to again begin by thanking the Democratic leader for giving the Congressional Black Caucus this time to focus on health care reform specifically, especially as the House is preparing to continue their attempts to repeal what we know is a good bill and a needed bill in this country. I just want, before I begin to yield time, to just recognize the 103rd anniversary of the NAACP. They have long been champions, premier champions of health care, fought for health care as a right. They are committed to eliminating the racial and ethnic disparities in our health care system that plague people of color in the United States. They have focused on eliminating disparities through their 880 campaign, which is a campaign that is based on the fact that over the past decade, because we have not, Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
House will be in order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Their 880 campaign is based on the fact that over a decade, because we have not eliminated health disparities, over 880,000 African Americans and other people of color have died premature deaths from preventable causes. That did not need to happen. And so we continue that fight in health care reform. We have made great strides in it, and we look forward to implementing that law despite the attempts to repeal today. So I want to congratulate the NAACP on their 103rd anniversary this evening. And I'd like to yield Are you going to speak? I'd like to yield such time as she might consume to the gentlelady from Texas, Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, the United States Supreme Court justly and commendably upheld the Affordable Care Act, ensuring that millions of Americans will continue to have access to quality, affordable health care. Despite this monumental victory for our country, for the 31st time since the enactment, Republicans are attempting to repeal the health care law, treating it as if this is just some kind of political game played between the two parties. While the Affordable Care Act will expand coverage for millions of Americans, many Texans will be denied access by their governor. And I'm a Texan. Just today, the Texas Governor, Rick Perry, announced his decision not to expand Medicaid or implement a state health exchange under the Affordable Care Act. No, nothing more than politics. However, during this announcement, Governor Perry failed to provide an alternative plan to address the growing numbers of uninsured Texans. Texas has the highest percentage of adults without health care insurance, and rejecting federal Medicaid funds would only worsen this predicament for Texans. Without the Affordable Care Act, millions of uninsured Americans will continue to seek primary care in our nation's overcrowded emergency rooms, leaving taxpayers to pay the tab if they own property. As a non-practicing registered nurse, I am all too familiar with this scenario, which has placed a huge burden on our nation's hospital systems. Mr. Speaker, this week's GOP messaging vote to repeal is nothing more than a political warfare on an election year. Instead of bringing job-creating bills to the floor, our leadership insists on wasting taxpayers' dollars by debating a law which has been firmly upheld by the nation's highest court. While the Republicans have introduced numerous measures to undermine and repeal the Affordable Care Act, they have repeatedly failed to introduce one piece of legislation which could serve as a viable alternative to the health care law. I urge my colleagues to reject this effort and take away patient protections for Americans. Instead, for once, let partisan politics come in second and let the American people win this one. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Johnson, and thank you for beginning to lay out the issue before us this evening. As we know that we've done landmark legislation in passing the Affordable Care Act. It is now settled law. The Supreme Court has ruled, and we have a lot of other work that the American people need us to do. At this time, I'd like to yield such time as she might consume to the gentlelady from Florida, Congresswoman Corrine Brown.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for leading this discussion on health care. You know, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And as we begin to discuss repealing of the health care law tomorrow, I would like to discuss just how exactly the Affordable Care Act benefits all Americans. Although not a perfect bill, and I've been elected in Congress for 20 years, and I've never seen a perfect bill, but a perfect beginning. And the reason why it's not perfect is because you make compromises throughout the process. This is a perfect start, and attempting to obtain universal health care has been a primary goal of every single president and Congress since the days of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who fought for quality access health care and health care insurance reform for all Americans. And now, 75 years later, after the Supreme Court ruling just over a week ago, our nation has finally attained that goal. Did you hear me? After 75 years, Every single president have tried to implement some form of universal health care. In fact, millions of Americans have already come to rely on the wide ranges and life-saving benefits of the Affordable Care Act. And let me say that as far as Obama health care is concerned, let me clear something up. It's President Barack Obama, and let me be clear, he does care. Let me say again, President Barack Obama does care. He cares deeply about the health and well-being of every American. Before Congress passed the Affordable Care Act, nearly 1 in 5 citizens in the wealthiest country on earth had little or no hope of affordable insurance or getting access to regular health care. And when fully implemented, the Affordable Care Act will cover an additional 30 million Americans and 3.8 million African Americans who otherwise would remain uninsured. Already under the Affordable Care Act, 17 million children with pre-existing conditions can no longer be denied coverage. 105 million Americans no longer have a lifetime limit on their coverage. 32 million seniors receive free preventive care in 2011. 54 million Americans in private plans have received free preventive services. 6.6 million young adults up to the age of 26 have obtained insurance through their parents' plan. 5.2 million seniors and disabled people save an average of $404 each on prescription drugs. 360 small businesses receive tax credit to help them afford coverage for 2 million workers. 13 million families receive insurance premium rebates averaging $151 in 2012. And in my congressional district of Florida, 6,900 young adults in the district will receive health care insurance, and 62 seniors receive prescription drug discount worth $3.6 million, and the average savings is $600 per senior. And 20,000 children and 80,000 adults now have health care insurance that cover preventive service without copay, co-insurance, or deductible. Every American has the benefits from this need and let their local representative. Every American who have benefited from this needs to let their local representative, their senator, and their governor know. We all have a dog in this fight. The Republican Party is constantly complaining about a tax and how this law will raise taxes. But I like to reply to them, the American taxpayers is already paying a hidden tax right now. Every single time one of the millions of our citizens who like health care insurance receive emergency care, that cost is passed on to paying customers throughout higher fees and premiums. So the question is, how can we begin to bring our country health care costs down? And this law is the first step in achieving this. In closing, as I always say, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. And I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank you, and I thank you for pointing out some of the benefits and the numbers of Americans who are enjoying those benefits already over these last 2 years. And those benefits, as you said, extend to all Americans, whether they live in democratic